to everyone that may or may not be watching. Okay, cool. We have like a number of people up there. Okay, so you have 10 people already. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining, or if you're listening later, thank you for watching later. Here with Sasha. Thank you so much, Sasha, for coming on. Have a chat across the Atlantic. I'm in Spain, and I guess you're in Colorado, right?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I am in Boulder right now.
Okay, yeah, nice. Which is where you live, right?
Yeah, I live here when I'm not traveling. Sometimes I'm like, I live in Boulder, but not too frequently am I around, as I'm sure you can agree with too.
Totally. Yeah, yeah. Same for us. Although now we have a daughter, we're maybe a little bit more stable than before. So cool, yeah. So I think like the topic of this conversation is really going to be around fear, which I mean maybe sounds a bit negative and hopefully it isn't. And I just want to start by firstly asking you, where does fear show up most for you in climbing? And then also could be interesting to hear where it might show up outside of climbing as well.
Yeah, totally. And I love the topic of fear because as we kind of riffed offline, people have this perception sometimes that, you've been climbing for a long time. Maybe you don't get scared while lead climbing or even climbing in the gym. I get nervous sometimes. And fear for me manifests in different stages. I would say that, like, when I'm in a lower confident stage of, call it like a day or a week, sometimes I go climbing and I have this irrational sense of fear of just like I could be climbing in the gym and I haven't lead climbed in a while because I've been training on a board. And all of a sudden I'm like, ooh, how is that fall going to feel like? Or I'll feel it if I'm on like an easier climb sometimes and like I'm like looking at different ledges. And I always like to say, like, because my husband is more of like he likes to climb, but climbing is not his thing. That I like look at some of the terrain that he has to lead on, and I'm like, ooh, that seems worse than some of the harder, like cleaner faces. So fear, I would say, comes to me sometimes irrationally. Very often it's correlated to like how I mentally am through the week and the month and the year and what I've been doing. I think that like that exposure training is really important when I go on like a climbing trip. The first week, I'm way more fearful than after I've been in an area climbing and like just inevitably falling. I'm always like, I fall all the time. Like, um, and then in other aspects of life, I think it's fear around doing something new and stepping into the unknown. Like, I started Send Bar as my nutrition bar company, and I still have so much fear because I am such a fish out of water in this new industry and building a team and learning about like ways in which to grow. I think that the
Mhm.
fear comes to like doing something in the unknown. I don't know if that is something that manifests for you as well for fear.
Totally, yeah. And I think that yeah, I found that when I started my business Strong Mind that fear showed up in these all these different ways. But it was interesting because before I started my business, I didn't really have any interest in business, but I just really wanted to kind of share what we do and coach people around mental training and climbing. But then because of those challenges that came up for me, I was like, oh, hang on a minute. Like, actually, this is a really interesting space. There's an opportunity to learn here. And yeah, it's definitely scary. And just to like riff off that a little bit, I know that you do a lot of work like in spaces outside climbing. So you mentioned your company Sembar, but like also, I've seen a picture with you with like Kamala Harris. And so like, you I think you're quite adaptable. That's kind of how I see you. You're like in the climbing space, but you're also kind of like work outside it a lot as well. And yeah, just be interesting to hear what you have to say about that because I think I would probably freak out if I met like a vice president.
I think sometimes, like, yes, I'm always fearful in new contexts and meeting politicians or people that just have a scope of knowledge that's outside of what I am really trained per se in. What I always try and do is like before I go and give a public presentation, whether it's to, I do some like corporate speaking too at this point, and try and just ground myself through breath work of like, okay, I'm about to go on stage. Sometimes I go on stage and I feel like I like black out. I don't know what happens, but I'm just like speaking and I'm like, what happened there? Or I'm gonna go and meet someone who's like a politician and it's just like, these are humans. Like we are all humans. We're all with faults. We've all made mistakes. We're all growing and learning and trying to just show up. And so I always just, even on like lives like this, I know that we have an audience. I come in sometimes and I'm like, ooh, I'm nervous. Like, how are people going to perceive me? I think that's such a human trait that is shared by the majority of us. And I think it does come down to the confidence in ourselves to just know that we can just lean into being ourselves and like try and answer, questions around like, how do I manage my fear while I'm climbing? Well, let me think about it. XYZ, just speak from like a genuine space. And so what I try and fall back on is just having that inner confidence. And if it's a context outside of climbing, like having confidence in my own experience and not trying to like overdo it in areas that I don't actually have the experience, if that makes sense.
Totally, yeah. And I think that, like, bringing it back to climbing, like a common fear in climbing is fear of falling, as you know. And something that people often do is they like try to practice falls that they aren't ready for yet. It's kind of like one of the like big mistakes that we see. And something that we notice with our courses is that we like really try to get people to kind of slow down and like be more gradual, be more incremental, which kind of requires like being really kind to yourself, right? To like not jump through the stages and like have too much expectations. And you like you not maybe not said it in those words, but you've mentioned quite a few times, not diving into things that you aren't ready for or that you don't have that experience in yet. And so I just wondered, like, is that something that you've learned from stepping outside of climbing, or do you feel like you kind of learned it within climbing and now you're applying that to other areas as well? Because I love that transition of kind of like being like, huh, I'm getting scared in climbing. How am I managing it in climbing? Well, can I manage it in the same way when I do like a public speaking event, for example?
Yeah, I would say that a big inflection point for me was actually during the time of all my hip surgeries because right before that happened, I went through it was almost like when the dominoes fall, they all fall. I was having so much hip pain. I was at this juncture where I went and I found out, what was going on with my hips. My femur head was essentially popping out of the socket on both sides. And I found that out because I went to go get a cortisone shot to go on this climbing trip to Mexico. And I was in so much pain that like I couldn't sleep at night. And so I just wanted a band-aid to get through that climb. And in that process, I learned that I was essentially looking down the barrel of 5 surgeries over the course of the next like 2 years. And I I like decided to go on the trip and I scheduled the surgeries for right after I got back. And the reason being was that I had already done so much damage to my hips that what was one more trip, it kind of became this like last hurrah for me because I was told it by many doctors that I may never return to professional climbing. And I had to come to a point of like calm with that. And it brought me a lot of light and purpose down the line that I'm really grateful for now, but I didn't realize at the time. And I went on this trip and it actually ended up not being a climbing trip. There was a total tragedy that happened with with Nolan and it's his story to share, but essentially he had a climbing accident and it was catastrophic and it created this like deep uncertainty for what climbing meant for me just overall because I've always gone on climbing trips, as I'm sure you do too, and like I've mitigated the risks. And I think that as I've gotten older, it's like my 26th year climbing, my fear has become greater. Like, and I don't know if it's because the more I develop my life outside of climbing and establish a family and sense of like being outside of this sport that's so much a part of my identity, like the more I feel fearful of losing that. And I'm not sure, but
Mm,
essentially, when I came back from that trip, like any idea of climbing, like I would go out before my surgeries, and I came back in March, at the time that like there's so much uncertainty happening in the world, because there's the whispers of what is COVID. It was March 2020,
mm,
um, and when I climbed outside before my surgeries, like every rock that I would grab, I felt like this is going to be the rock that breaks off and I fall and it cuts my rope. Like it was a crazy, irrational set of like just mind games that were happening in my mind. But I only had 2 weeks before then I went under the knife and I essentially didn't climb for 9 months.
mm,
And so that fear really manifested into me. And like my relationship with climbing was so dark and so uncertain. Like I didn't know if I even wanted to return to climbing. And I, through my career, have gone through just like trauma, and I've learned to just say it as it is. I've been so grateful for what I've experienced in my career, but I've also um, really like just felt like an outsider at times and questioned a lot about it. And so when I was coming back from my hip surgeries, I had this like for the first time in my life, like this runway to have zero expectations of what I
mm,
wanted out of climbing, anyone like judging my performance in climbing. Like I wasn't even expected to be there. So people were looking at me climbing and I didn't have this like internal feeling of like I need to prove myself because I was even surprised to be able to top rope. And this
mm,
was about like 9 months after coming back. And that time really like clicked for me that I did want to be back. Like I
mm,
cried the first day that I got to go back and like top rope. And it was like I just felt the like connection of being there and like, wow, I really genuinely miss this from like a place in my heart. But I
mm,
wasn't leading and I was like on top rope. And what was trippy about it was I had all this residual fear, but then also like my pelvic bone had been broken into four pieces on both sides of my hips and like all these reconstructive surgeries. And that's where the harness was. So I was like terrified to fall. And I
mm,
didn't know like I could before I got the screws taken out, I could feel like where the screws were poking out. And that was like those like harness and screws. And that's when I started actually leaning into like, I need to do this work because I didn't experience it so much before. But now I'm just like, so laden with like the deepest, darkest fears of like anything I do in climbing is going to be a catastrophic result. Um, and so I think I've gone completely tangential to what your question was, that I'm even trying to like bring myself back to it. But I think that that was like a big inflection point for me of realizing like, wow, I've done a really deep dive into like just my purpose in climbing, what I want out of it, and also realizing that I need to be more kind to myself, because if we're not kind to ourselves, like we are our own worst enemy. And I've gone through that a lot of being my deepest, darkest enemy internally.
wow, thanks so much for sharing all that. There's definitely a lot that's like super interesting there, and a lot of it is relatable as well. Um, I guess maybe I'd start with if it's not kind of like too painful, like just to say, for those of you who don't know, that trip in Mexico, one of your teammates died really sadly. I actually knew Nolan, amazing guy. Um, and not to sort of, I don't want to go into that or anything, but I did want to just say that, like, even when we witness an accident and we don't experience it ourselves, that is like a kind of trauma, right? And that can set us back massively in terms of our resilience and confidence. And then on top of that, you had an injury, which took you out of climbing. And again, being taken out of climbing, people often think, okay, it's only your physical ability that's disrupted, but your mental game, oh gosh, my phone is doing something. Your mental gain is like something that you have to practice, right, and keep on top of, just like your physical um there we go. Just like your physical game, right? And it's not something that you can switch on and off. And I think that that's kind of one of the deep myths in climbing, is that, like, when it comes to the psychological stuff, like, you just do it, right? You just get on with it. Um but like, psychological trauma is like a physical trauma. We have to recover from it. We have to give ourselves time, give ourselves space, as you said, be self-kind, and then slowly build up. And so, yeah, just it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about, like, how you did that. It sounded like you came back to, like, your deep love for the sport, which is so nice to hear. Because I think that a lot of climbers who've been climbing a long time can kind of forget that, can actually lose touch of it, especially professional climbers where it's our jobs to do it. Um, and it's really easy to lose that, like, deep love for the sport without the expectations, the pressure, all the rest of it. So maybe you could tell us just, like, other things that really helped you build your confidence again, and where you feel like with your current level of confidence, and like how you're climbing at the moment.
Yeah, totally. I would say I learned still the wrong way or the hard way. I became really fixated on this idea of going back to Mexico and like being like, this is where all the dominoes fell. I need to go back to the point and get there as soon as possible to be on this road to recovery. And for all intents and purposes, like I forced it. I went too soon. I was not in shape and I was super scared. And after that trip, like it's kind of like when you create something in your mind that like this is what it's going to lead to. Like I'm going to do this and then it's going to be the magical little fairy dust sparkle that makes me feel like all is better and I'm fine. It really wasn't. And I got to the top of that climb. It was logical progression on El Gigante. And I just cried. Like
Mm.
I just felt like wow, like I'm so grateful to be back and to be able to like be having this adventure, but I am exhausted. I feel like I tried to fit this like square into a circle, and I realized in that moment like I don't want to be doing stuff for anyone else but myself. And I'm just so, I just went through this journey where I didn't know what I was going to come back to. And now, like, I have this opportunity and like this climb, like, I'm grateful that I did force it because it showed to me that I could come back and I could climb and I could do a big adventure, but I needed to really operate on my own timeline. And so I think that after that, I kind of zoomed back and was like, I'm going to take some time to really like think about what climbing means to me and Um, what I want out of this experience of like when I go on a trip, I want to be excited about it. I want to feel ready for it. I want to be with the people that really like make me feel confident in myself. And so that really I think just like further unlocked this turning point for me of like saying let's scale it back and like do I think I even like think about falling and falling like sometimes at the gym I have to do this exercise like being next to the bolt and just being like I'm just gonna let go and then climb a little bit higher and then let go. And so like that incremental progress is kind of like a microcosm for every other aspect of dealing with fear
Mhm.
too. It's like
Mhm.
when you're really scared of something or something's really intimidating, instead of looking at this like big massive goal and saying I'm going to go do this and that's like what I'm going to
Mhm.
do, like breaking it up into small pieces and setting little I guess my sports psychologist calls it smart goals. um and I'm going to butcher the acronym. It was like small, essentially realistic attainable goals that are in the trajectory of like where you want to go. So I
Mhm.
would say, to answer the question, yeah, that like starting small and trying to meet myself where I'm at.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. Um, so you mentioned that you work with a sports psychologist. A lot of pro athletes don't, and I just wondered what motivated you to do that, and what do you like, where in that timeline did that come in? And did you also get any other kind of like external help to manage what seems like being like a really difficult period of time for you?
Yeah, well, so I started seeing a therapist shortly after my dad passed away. He passed away really suddenly, and I didn't handle it well. I was young. I was like in my early 20s and was just like go go go, not really thinking about like the repercussions of just like what I was doing to myself. And then about 2 years later, when I graduated from university, like I started seeing a therapist because I just kind of had this like moment of all of this just stuff happening where and I finally had this moment of pause because I wasn't trying to be a full-time professional athlete, full-time student running around like a chicken without his head on straight. And that was the beginning of like me working with a professional. And then it wasn't until right after Mexico that I flew back, and actually Red Bull's High Performance Center set me up with a sports psychologist to just like he called me. His name was Eric Potterat, and he was this phenomenal sports psychologist who it was just like some check-ins by the phone. And I spoke with him. It was very like loosely oriented. And then my friend who does Summits of the Mind, her name is Suzu Cornelis. She's been a great friend of mine through like my climbing, and we used to compete against each other when we were younger. She and I started working together in like a looser format too, and she was amazing. Like I learned a lot, and I do have to be very candid. Like I have not kept up with it. And it's something that I think like I keep seeing your courses and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to sign up because this is so effective and so good for all of us. And I just want to say that too, because like, yeah, I'm a pro climber, but I get terrified. And I see the stuff that you do and I'm like, how? And I really appreciated even when I was in Yosemite and I was like kind of like figuring out, okay, do I want to go on El Nino or do I want to keep working this other project? And recognizing, just having the conversation with you and appreciating like your open mindedness of like, this is what the route's like. And then me having this conversation with myself of like, do I want to subject myself to that? Because sometimes I'm just learning like it's okay not to. Like we don't have to go on a trip and send it all the time. And I think that that's what I used to try and do and like force things and it just like wasn't always like the most authentic part of me. And I regret that. Like I sincerely regret that, but I also
Mm.
think that like we all grow up and we learn, and that's been very powerful. So to answer the question, like working with professionals and working through the courses like strong mind, so effective. And I need to do a better job of it. I see my therapist about once to twice a week, and it's at the point that like she'll text me if she doesn't see me on the books and be like, are we okay? And I'm like, no, we're not. um but
Nice.
yeah, I
Thanks. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And I think something that's coming a lot for me as you're speaking is kind of this balance between like you know, you're a professional climber, there's lots of pressures, expectations, and kind of if not, you know, not allowing yourself to make decisions from that place of fear, from that place of like, I need to do this thing. Um, and so some people might be listening and they're like, well, I can't relate to that because I'm not a professional climber. But I think that in all of our lives, we have those like what I would call extrinsic motivators. So like motivators that are like not within the thing that you're doing. So like in climbing, like if we're intrinsically motivated, then we're motivated for like our love for the movement, our love for the sport, like being outside, like just like the thing in itself. And then there's sometimes these extrinsic factors. And like as a professional, the obvious extrinsic thing is like you're getting paid to do it. Um and you've built this like amazing career around like all these achievements, right? And you don't get to be a professional climber without the achievements. So like to some extent, like to continue that career, right, you still have to achieve, but it's really hard to achieve things when you don't perform well. And you don't perform well when you're like really extrinsically motivated, when that feels like that pressure's there, or you're forcing it, or you're doing it out of fear. And I've personally learned so much from trying to balance all of that to be like, okay, well, you know, I'm getting paid to do this thing. And like people expect me to be doing that at a high level. But at the same time, I really have to follow like what I'm motivated for, or otherwise I'm not going to show up and be at my absolute best. And it sounds like you've had kind of like a similar journey of like, you know, I think we're both in our 30s now, right? I think you're a bit younger than me.
I'm
Um,
32.
yeah, so I'm 30, am I 35? Yeah, I'm 35. Um, and you know, it's taken me kind of a long time to learn that. And I think that the learning process has been accelerated by like all of the study and the work that I've done in order to become a mental training coach. But I think the biggest thing for me underneath all of that is self-awareness. It's like if you aren't aware of how you're being motivated, then you can't do anything about it. So yeah, I'm just wondering, like, obviously therapy is a great way to become self-aware. I think our online course that we offer, the Strong Mind program, which we'll provide a link for, but one of the biggest takeaways for so many people is that they really feel like they've uncovered these aspects of themselves. They've uncovered some fears that were like lurking under the surface that they maybe weren't quite aware of, or they've uncovered habits that are actually deepening their fears. And then the whole process of like what we might call unlearning fear, or becoming more comfortable with the things that scare us, really requires self-awareness. Because if you are too stressed, like falling's like a great example. Like if you're too stressed when you take a fall, then all you're telling your nervous system is this thing is dangerous. Whereas if you take a fall and your body is relaxed, your mind is relaxed, then you're reinforcing this idea, okay, I'm in a safe place. But until you have that self-awareness, it's really difficult to make those forward steps. So yeah, I'm just wondering like kind of how you feel about that, whether self-awareness is something that you kind of actively cultivate. I know that it's like definitely something that I feel I've got better at as I've got older, but also partly I've also realized how I lack self-awareness as well, which I guess is a type of self-awareness, not to get too meta, but yeah, just wondering kind of like how you think about kind of self-knowledge and self-awareness.
Yeah, no, I relate to that so much. I think that self awareness is like one of those beautiful gems that we get to grow into. Um, and I reflect on it a lot actually because I think about when we're young and like even just like our amygdala is forming and like all of these aspects of like we're learning self-awareness. And something that I've grappled with is that my awareness and like journey to that has been very public. And
Mm,
I like had my first sponsorship when I was 12 years old, and
nice.
I had to grow up in many ways in this like it's all by niche because it's climbing in the outdoor industry, but like this limelight, and make mistakes, and like have people's opinions of me carry through. And I was so affected by it, like just
Mhm.
other people's opinions, and just like feeling this like discontinuity of like what people think about me, what I believe of myself, like just like living in this imposter syndrome of like, you know, trying to prove myself, all these very kind of toxic cyclical things that lead to so much stress in your life.
Yeah.
And I recently read this book called The Body Keeps the Score. I wish I remember the
Mhm.
author, maybe you've read it too, but it was really fascinating because these like lived experiences of times of stress and times of even now I think about like I have an office job in many ways. Like sometimes I'm like on meetings from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And that's because I have like a small business startup. And then I go to my garage where I do a lot of my training. And I'm just like, can't help myself from going back on like Slack or Asana and like checking in. And I've really had to practice like, this is where we're going to be responding to emails, and this is the area where we're going to focus on training. And I would say that yes, like the exterior factors of our lives are so intertwined with our performance, and even just like what we eat, how we surround ourselves by the right people. For me, a sense of community is really something I got to lean into. Maybe some of our audience can relate to, of like being in one place and kind of needing to choose selectively who we spend our time with,
Mhm.
because it was like almost like illegal to stay in big groups, that we like you had to be like, okay, these are my people through this time. And through that I got a good sense of just like knowing that I had a circle that knew me and that I cared about and that I respect, and even beyond like, the COVID pod, so to speak, but just like having the voices that you listen to and the voices that you don't. And maybe that is something that is a professional athlete issue, but I think it goes beyond. Like we're all affected by our workplace, we're all affected by like the way in which we show up for our community, and the way in which like anyone's opinions or the stressors that we have are going to then carry over into like how we show
Mhm.
up on the wall. It's climbing
Yeah.
so mental. Like I feel it. The days that I'm super stressed, I feel like a sack of potatoes climbing.
Mhm.
Versus like if
Yes.
things are good, I'm like, okay, we're like flowing, and we're feeling like we
Mhm.
have movement on the wall.
Yeah, totally. And I guess that's just like kind of goes to the heart of this conversation. And like, obviously, I'm quite biased and because I care deeply about all this stuff, but climbers care so much about like being a kilogram heavier than normal, right? But like, if you bring stress and negativity with you to the climbing gym, that weighs a lot more than a kilogram. Does
It
for
weighs
me
so
anyway.
much.
Yeah. Um, So yeah, you've been like really visible, as you mentioned, throughout your whole career, and that's a huge burden, really. I mean, it's a privilege, right? Because you've made a career out of doing something that you love, but it's also a burden in terms of like your mental health and just being an added stressor, I guess. And something that like I think we all struggle with, whether we're aware of it or not, is this fear of what other people think. We're like such social creatures. Like physical danger is one thing that we kind of focus on a lot in climbing. And it's quite interesting that we haven't really even talked about like risk. Like you've mentioned so many things that scare you. And of course, what happened with Nolan and everything, that was a physical thing that happened, right? It was a really dangerous environment, and that was obviously a physical risk there. But so many of the things you've mentioned, there's not even risk to your physical being. It's the risk of kind of being judged or being thought badly of, and our social world. is so important to us that when we feel threatened socially, it's almost like a threat to our physical safety. Um, and I think that we completely underestimate the power that has to shape our decisions in climbing and in life. Um, so yeah, how do you think of like fear of what other people think, and like how have you learned any strategies for kind of silencing that part of our brains?
Yeah. I would say that, to be perfectly candid, like, it's a daily activity that I work on. And I think about it with, to be quite frank, my background of just having disordered eating, because you mentioned, like, as climbers, we think about like the kilo that we have or don't have too. And what I've realized in both of these journeys is like, I need to show up and recognize them and say, like, I'm going to give this some time, like even 30 minutes of my day. It's I'm going to open this box and I'm going to confront it and I'm going to reflect on it. And for me, like a big point of reflection has always been just like writing. Like I'm at my desk right now. I have like 18 notepads that are all just like scribbles that I end up like recycling anyways. Um, but I think it's like confronting these topics head on, but also having the boundaries that we can inflict on ourselves to like know when to put the lid on them, so to speak, and like put them back on the shelf. Because with things that happen mentally, what I've found is like I can't just not address them. I have to. I have to, and it's part of like even why I founded Sun Bars was like I had not had a good track record with nutrition. And so in order to come back from it, like I wanted to learn everything. I wanted to like learn how I could fuel my body, not just like to climb hard. I just wanted to like be healthy so that one day I could have a family, so that I like don't have osteoporosis and like all of these aspects that like I think are under talked about in athletics and climbing, but also like cycling and running. All of these sports deal with them. So to the point of like how to deal with it, I think that it's just giving the space of conversation and like the candor to it. I think that my direct community has brought me a lot of strength, like even stepping, and I hate to say it because like I know we have an audience full of climbers and that's amazing, like the climbing community is amazing, but for me there's aspects of it that became very toxic. And so I needed to find community outside of it, and just like even people who love climbing but are not so in the nuances and granular level of like the pro level, because I do find it can be very elitist, can be very isolating, it can be very clicky, and I think that that's like the worst side of our sport, frankly. And so
Mm.
stepping outside of that and being okay with it, like I had to be like, you know what, I don't fit in, and that's going to be okay. And like that happened later. Like maybe that happened when I was like 25 or 26, where I was just like, I am so done with trying to get people who hate me to like me, because guess what? That's never going to happen. And like I kind of had to keep saying that and like be
Yeah.
okay with it. And like even find the power in saying like not everyone is going to like you. Maybe some people like, I don't know. I'm sure everyone loves you.
No.
But like
They
it's really
don't.
hard. It's like a infinite climb to try and go there.
Yeah, yeah, I think there's I don't know what kind of person you'd have to be to have everyone to like you, but I think there would be a serious cost to that, right? And I think along the lines of that body keeps the score book, there's all that work done by Gabor Mate about how chronic people pleasers often end up very sick. And you can see it, right? Because you have to constantly be in some ways slightly inauthentic because we're all unique. So we're not all going to mesh with everyone, right? So then if you're having to adapt yourself constantly to mesh with everyone around you, that's a huge stress. And so yeah, we can't be liked by everyone. And no, certainly everyone's not like me. Um, but it's so painful, isn't it, when you feel disliked? I think it's one of the sort of the most painful experiences. And so being visible, I mean, YouTube is horrendous for it. The comments on YouTube is just like you read like 50 positive comments, and then that one negative comment just hits you so hard.
It
And you just
stays.
have to
I don't know what it is.
you have to breathe through it. You have to be like, okay, this isn't about me. This is about them.
Yeah,
Um, but
totally.
one of the key things I really loved what you said was it's a daily practice. And I think that a lot of the students who kind of show up to our courses or who I've coached personally, they often people think that when it comes to mindset and head game, it's like you do this thing and then all of a sudden like you're fixed. It's a kind of like this fix mindset kind of. Um, Whereas like the reality is that this is kind of like the long work, right? It's like but that makes it sound bad and negative, but I think it's really cool because of that. I think that, like, if you commit to, building a strong mind for climbing and therefore that's spilling over to the rest of your life, there's just so much you can get out of it. Not only, like, is it interesting, I think, but it's also just, like, you'll be a happier person because of it, and I just wondered whether like all of the things that you've learned over the years, all of these like challenging situations and times and like being very visible and like having to put a lot of work into your head game, you know, what's your relationship, I guess, with that daily practice like? Do you feel positive about it? Do you feel negative about it? Like, and then I guess like how would you talk about that to someone who's maybe like a bit skeptical about kind of mental training or working with a therapist or something like that.
I think that it's similar to the theme of working on falls. You have to like start small. And so a way that I try and keep up with the practice is every day I try and say, I'm going to put this timer on and I'm going to spend 5 minutes writing. And for me, sometimes that's like dangerous because I'll spend 2 hours writing. Like, actually, when I was writing my book, like, I would just write probably 99% of what I wrote, like, just got recycled because writing is a reflection or a reflective process for me. But what I think is like a sustainable way to approach like doing something and developing that habit is giving it like a tangible amount of your day, because if you're like, even that's my struggle with yoga, to be honest, because it's like normally an hour. Sometimes that's hard for me
Mm,
to incorporate, like to show up for an hour of my day. And I think that if you're like, okay, I'm gonna write for an hour, like give this like self-reflection thought an hour of each day, that kind of does accumulate and it can be unsustainable. So I think being honest with the time that you have available and just like developing the ritual is a good start, because then you get in the practice of it. And then, as I think, like anything, like when it brings this sense of like, oh, this is working for me, like it is training. Like I love that you refer to it as training, because if we were trying to improve in climbing and taking just purely the physical. And we were like, okay, I know I want to get better at climbing. So I'm going to show up occasionally and like go climb.
mm,
And then like we let a month go by and we don't climb. Well, we're not really going to see tangible results. But if we show
mm,
up on like a um, consistency pattern of like, okay, I'm going to show up like today and tomorrow, and maybe I'll give myself a rest day, then we start seeing like the cumulative effect. And I think that that does go into the mental training component too, like enabling ourselves to embark on this path to like really find out. And I do think that what's interesting for me and like a hurdle that I had to overcome is like when we're meditating or writing or giving like therapy time, it's not creating that like physical output. And as athletes, like I personally have noticed this, like I feel satisfaction with myself, like a job well done feeling when I climb something.
Mhm.
And it's almost like a disservice to myself because I don't have that same feeling when like I graduate from university or like publish an article or whatever that is.
Mm.
And I'm starting to really work on feeling a sense of satisfaction when like I do something that's disassociated from the physical. And I don't
Mm.
know if that's like a pro athlete issue, if that's like a more universal issue. But that also I think is something because it's like not tied to the release of like adrenaline and
Mm.
like physical exhaustion that it can still be a point of celebration, if that makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't actually I can totally relate to mental training not feeling tangible. And it's something that we kind of come back to a lot at Strong Mind is kind of how to make mental training more tangible, how to kind of like build these habits into your and routines into your life and into your climbing that can feel satisfying in the same way that like doing some bicep curls can. um, and I think the reality is that it's probably not going to ever feel maybe as satisfying as that, but maybe it's satisfying in a different kind of way. I think I'm kind of, in some ways, I'm like probably a lot lazier than most professional athletes. I can like sit on the couch and read a book kind of person. So I don't like like yeah, then I definitely feel satisfaction from lots of different tasks in my life, but it's really interesting that you said that just because it's a different perspective. Um, but
I'm
yeah,
envious
habit
of that.
building. Yeah, envious. Well,
Like
I
I
don't know.
have to like listen to a lot of the books that I read while I'm like hiking my dog or something like that. It's hard for me to sit down. It's definitely something that I'm learning as I've kind of given myself a self-prescribed office job too.
Yeah, yeah, totally, and I could definitely relate to that. I mean, no, I mean, I love to move my body. I love to be outdoors. But I'm not sort of like I can be calm and still too. But I think the like it's the habits, isn't it? You know, it's what you kind of need um to work on, and then building habits around that. Um, and it sounds like you've done that for yourself. You have built those good habits. What do you think are like the things you still need to work on, and where do you think you could um yeah, I don't know, like branch out or like try new areas or something?
Everything. I think I think like working on being kind to myself, still practicing the like letting things roll off my back and being okay with, how I show up and even reconciling like mistakes that I've made in the past and like being like, you know what? That sucks. And like now me like I wouldn't have done it that way. And can we turn back the tides of time? Like we actually can't. But what we can do is like own who we are now and own the relationships and the ways in which we show up to people and just be like as genuine as we can. And so that is a part of my practice. It's just like being okay with that and being okay with who I am as like this fluid being. Like we're all like changing and learning and growing. And I think that that's a big part of it for me. And then incorporating the balance, like when I was a teenager and like in my early 20s, like I had a different relationship with climbing than I do now. And now something that I've learned to like really embrace and find like excitement in is this like the new generation is just leveling up climbing in such a
Mhm,
big way. And I look at it and I think that like I really practice like this thinking of abundance because I think that
mm,
something that I've fallen victim to too, and that does plague like our community is the scarcity mindset of,
Mm,
if this person has this, then that means that this person
mm,
can't achieve it or isn't going to have that. And I think that it might have, um, aspects that are more universal to it too, like beyond like the really like nuanced way of looking at what it means to be like professionally climbing, but just in general, like how to be as supportive as we can to our friends and our community and people that, we're all gonna have like senses of like who we're competitive with or like
mm,
who we kind of compare ourselves with. And so I think that it's really advantageous for me personally, like to accept that as what it is, but also to learn how to give it the space that it deserves and see it as like finding that like grace and support that I can have for that person who's like achieving. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but it's been a transition that I've noticed too, just like as someone who's like had a long-term relationship in climbing, and had a lot of like ups and downs and seasons where
mm,
I'm just like, wow, really not strong. And then times in my career where I've been like, I'm, feeling really good and I'm like taking off these things. So uh, it's an interesting thing because climbing is one of those sports that like you could expect to be performing year round, but that's
mm,
such an unrealistic pursuit as
mm.
well.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, oh man, so many interesting things you said there. I really like what you mentioned about scarcity and abundance. We're actually well, we're about to launch the Strong Mind program, which is like fear management focused, which you should definitely
I'm excited about it.
at least dip into. But we also have like another course in the pipeline that's like purely on mindset, and it's more of like a self discovery, um, like kind of trying to figure out basically like the mindset that you really want to have for yourself, like rather than us saying, okay, this is the best mindset, more just like introducing concepts and then trying to figure that out. And scarcity and abundance is one of those mindset pieces. And I really liked how you use that in the context of comparisons, because and you said something about like, maybe it's just a pro climber thing, but something that comes up a lot with our students is comparisons and how they are a real drain on motivation and performance and positivities, even within, your immediate friendship group. And that idea that like if someone does a climb before you, it somehow takes something away from you. And it's like
Yeah.
so sad that we have that, right? Because why does it somehow make you look like a worse climber when someone else does something quicker? But I find that uncomfortable space, maybe you could call it like your shadow side, like the side
Oh,
of
I
us
like
that
that.
like isn't like the thing that we love about ourselves, but like rears its ugly head, like kind of like just our ego, really. Um, and yeah, just I kind of like going there because it feels uncomfortable, but it's like there's such a bounty there as well. Like when you peel back the layers of our shadow side, like what's lurking there and what could I kind of like how could I benefit from like digging a little bit into that like dark place? Yeah, and we don't have tons of time, but it would just be interesting to hear what you think about that, because I think as pro climbers who are super visible and like spend a lot of our lives actually kind of chasing achievement to some extent, and you mentioned that like in some ways you regret some of the achievements you had because you did it like with a bad mindset. um just like how you think about that kind of ego-y side of things.
I would say like I love the idea, and I've never had that term brought to my attention. Like definitely gonna be more aware of that, the shadow side, because it's so true. And I think that the ego in life gets in the way of things. Like it makes us do things that are inauthentic to ourselves. And I think that we need to be aware of our ego too. It can be like a driver, and I'm like a very like gut instinctual feeling person. Like I'm sure a lot of us are like when something doesn't sit right, it it doesn't sit right. And I think that like going there and giving ourselves this space to like really learn more about like every aspect of like the deepest darkest channels of like why we think the way that we think. And it was actually a formative aspect of like, so during my time off from climbing was when I was writing my book as well, and I had to really like go into these um foundational memories that I hadn't really revisited, and learn a lot about myself along the way of like uncovering them and
Mm,
considering them. And I would say that like that was not a complete piece because I continue to do that. And I think that like that we all should be curious about every aspect of who we are and like how we show up to the people that we surround ourselves with too. And it's brought a lot of compassion and forgiveness to my life too. Like, and even past relationships that I've had, like I've been able to own myself and how I drove that relationship to its death of the relationship too. That's like a dramatic way to say it. But like just like what we've done wrong, and even like, some friendships do happen to be seasonal, and like being okay with that, but recognizing like, all right, like how did I mess this up? And like
mhm,
where could I have learned from that? Or like where was my ego in the way, and putting other people in a weird position, like all of that. I think like the more open we can be with ourselves, the more like we can learn in order to not necessarily like right our wrongs, but right our future.
mm. Yeah, I like that. Um, we have a few minutes left, so if anyone has any questions, now's the moment to put it in the chat. We've got some great comments, so thanks people for chipping in. It sounds like there's been some good conversations going on in the chat. I've not seen any specific questions, but now's the time to ask one if you have one. And if we're just waiting for that, we're also going to put a link to the waitlist for the Strong Mind program. It's cool. I think I've seen some past students in the chat as well. And basically, if you've enjoyed kind of like talking about this stuff, then I think you would really love the program, because not only do we kind of help you manage various of like the most common fears in climbing, like fear of falling, heights exposure, fear of injury, those sorts of like climbing specific fears. We also talk a lot about fear of failure and what we call social fears. And we have like at least 2 calls per week where we really like dive into the nuance of it all. And like those chats are always really amazing. And I think one of the things that people love about our program is that they like feel heard. They feel like they can finally like have this space to kind of just like be vulnerable, like kind of how we have here, even though obviously this is like way more visible. But just like share, be vulnerable, learn from each other. So we'll put the wait for list for that soon. It's basically launching in a few weeks, and we only do it once a year, and we tend to sell out pretty fast. So if you're interested, join the wait list, and we'll be sending like videos, 6 videos out over the course of the next few weeks, so you can learn more about fear management in climbing. Cool. All right, so we have a few questions. Maybe I have consistent fall practice and would like to start falling mid move. Do you have any advice for mid move fall practice? Cool, so I can answer that. I'm mindful of your time, Sasha. I could probably stay on a little bit, but have you got a few more minutes? Are
Yeah,
you
I can
like
linger for a little longer. I also am signing up for that course. I'm gonna join the wait list. Sounds
very nice?
amazing.
um Mid move, sorry, yeah. So to answer, okay, that person's name I can't say because it's too many letters in a row, but Mr. Laser would like to start falling mid move. Do you have any advice for mid move fall practice? Um, I think that mid-move full practice is really good to do, but only when you have like a really solid foundation of just like a standard full practice first. And really like with these sorts of things with full practice, it's more about how you feel when you do the fall rather than like what the actual protocol is. So like a lot of people would say, okay, fall at this bowl and then fall from here, then fall from here, like in this really like systematic way. But that doesn't really make sense if you feel stressed at any point of that time in that time. So in the program, we what we tend to do first is help people build self-awareness around their stress responses first and then get them to manage what they specifically do after that with some um tips and strategies, but really like the foundational thing is like, how do I actually feel in this moment? Um, so with regards to midriff football practice, it's I'd have to know more about whether it's the right thing for you to do. Is kind of like the short answer. Someone said Greece trips soon. Is that to Sasha or to us? Because we are actually going to Mallorca soon for a retreat, and I know that you've ran some retreats in Greece also, right? Are you have you got any more on the horizon?
I wish I was that organized. I feel like since starting Sen, I've been like, gosh, I gotta, and that also is something I've learned, like just temper what I'm doing so I can show up as my best self by not saying yes to everything. But I love Greece and I'd love to go back. It's always on my mind.
I love Greece too. I think it's like my spirit home. I just feel so good when I'm there. But to be fair, I've not been there in summer and I fear that it would be too hot for me in summer. Um, Third Kingdom asks, what's next for Sasha? I'm also curious about this.
I'm going to Mexico on Tuesday to go on like a sport climbing trip, which I'm excited about. And then I am going to go to Smith Rocks, which I've only spent like one day, like 8 or 9 years ago there. And so
Wow.
it was like not enough. So I'm going to go there for 2 weeks, kind of juggling like, showing up to like some trade shows and stuff like that for my business. But I do want to go back to Yosemite too. I was working on this project, and maybe it's like a big, crazy, audacious goal. It's very cool section of the wall, and excited to go back there in the fall as well.
Nice. That's all sounds super exciting. All right. Do we have any more questions? Okay. Adina says, any ideas when the new course on mindset will be coming out? I'm a past student of the Strong Mind program and highly recommend it to others. So packed with fiber. Cool. Thank you for your kind words about the program and the course. The new mindset course, I would say in a couple of months. There's a chance we might have it ready like at a similar time as the Strong Mind program, but um, life is a lot slower when you have a baby.
I don't know how you
Which
do it.
I don't know how we do it either. It's ridiculous. We're trying to do so many things at once right now. But it's kind of made already. We've actually filmed all the lessons, but there's a lot that goes into course production other than just making the lessons. But hopefully soon, Adina, to answer your question. All right, I don't want to take any more of your precious time. Oh, is mental training in the climbing becoming more popular in the US? Yeah, I mean, yeah, quick question. Do you feel like mental training is becoming more of a thing? Like, is it, is that
I think
like,
so.
yeah.
I think that it's like a global thing that people are being
Mm,
more aware of just their mental health. And I think that there's probably more content around just like the physical side of training and like
mm.
all these programs that it's exciting to see what Strong Mind's doing, and Summits of the Mind is Suzu, and I don't know all the different programming and stuff, but I like to think so.
Yeah, yeah, me too. Yeah, I think it is part of a general trend to just be more switched on to what's going on internally. And I think it's all really exciting. Obviously, I'm biased, but yeah, I think it's great. And so, yeah, thank you so much, Sasha, for coming on. This has been great. I feel like I've got to know you more. And yes, thank you for being vulnerable and like sharing all of this stuff has been really interesting. I might dip in and just like type some answers to some questions, but I'll let you go.
Cool. I super appreciate chatting with you, and hopefully we can do a climbing trip sometime too.
Yeah, that'll be fun. Do
I'm
you like
excited for the
babies?
course. Talk to you later.
Bye.